In this video, we're going to talk about animation in Blender 4.4, specifically looking at an important change to the animation system called Slotted Actions. Slotted Actions is an update or enhancement to the action function in previous versions of Blender that was implemented to allow for better organization to related animations within a file. I recently finished a small animation job in Blender 4.4 and had to become familiar with this new system. I found that it could be confusing if you didn't have a basic understanding of what was going on with it. Unfortunately, after looking at various videos on YouTube about this new system, I found them lacking in my personal opinion. So, we're going to do a basic look at this new slotted action system in Blender 4.4. So our starting point is going to be a very simple file. I'm not going to introduce any kind of complex animation to make this very, very clear. So let's do this. I've already got a collection that we're going to put our animated elements in, and we're going to create a cube. Let's come over here, make sure it's aligned to world, and we're going to set it to 0.5 meter. Okay, and then we're going to introduce a sphere, a UV sphere. Let's do the same thing. Let's set this to just a little bit about the size, maybe just a slight bit smaller. And then we're going to add one final element. We're going to add an empty, just a plain axis empty. And that will function as an animating guide for what we're about to do. So the first thing that we need to do is take these three elements and sort of organize them because they're all going to be animated. Let's take and rename the empty. We'll call this sphere rotation. And I want to take the sphere itself and I want to parent it by holding the shift key and dragging it onto that empty. And then I'm going to take the sphere itself and I'm going to move it out. So if we look at this in the top view, it'll be out just a little ways. Then we're going to take this sphere rotation and we want to parent it to the cube itself. So hold the shift key again and drag it on top of cube. And then we can see this hierarchical relationship between these three items. So with this sphere rotation, I know that's a mouthful to say, I can take and rotate that sphere around the cube as if it were orbiting the cube. So let's go ahead and animate this setup now. The first thing we'll do is come up to the cube. Let's go ahead and move it to the left, which is negative along the X direction. Our view is up top and we're looking down. Press the period key and let's assign our pivot point to the active element there. Let's go ahead and make sure, let's just do this exactly, minus 1.5 meters. Let's go ahead now and set a keyframe for this first location. We're at time 1. So let's come over here, click that to put a keyframe down, and then we will move the current time marker down here to the 100 frame mark. And we want to move this to the other side. Let's do this exactly 1.5 in the positive X direction, and then click the diamond to add a new keyframe. So now we have our basic animation of this setup moving left to right. The next thing that we want to do is orbit the sphere around the cube. So we're going to select that empty, which controls the rotation of the sphere. And let's go ahead and set a keyframe for it around the Z axis. So come down here and set a keyframe. We're at frame 1. And then let's come back over to frame 100. And let's type in 720. Which will give us 2 full rotations and set the keyframe down. So when we come back here and play this, we now have this rotating as we move the cube. Let's go ahead and reset back to the first keyframe. In this case, we'll select the sphere and we want to animate it moving closer to the cube along the y-axis. So location Y, let's go ahead and click, put a keyframe there, and then let's move to 100. And we want to move closer to the cube and put a keyframe. So now we have a system set up where we're moving the cube, rotating the sphere, and moving it closer to the cube. Now let's talk for a minute about what Blender has done for us. When we look here in the outliner, we can see our 3 objects, and we can see that we have animation data for each of those. when we expand this animation data, we have an action that's been automatically created for us in the background for each of these animated items. And this is the key to understanding where the change has been made in Blender 4.4. Each of these actions is a way of storing information that we've encoded in our animation in a data structure, and every object can have multiple actions assigned to it. So it's a way of taking your animation data and essentially organizing it in data structures. So let's go ahead and collapse these so that we're not looking at those, and let's come over and take a look. Down here in the animation, we're going to switch over from the basic timeline. We're going to come over to the dope sheet. The dope sheet is, again, just another way of seeing sort of a composite of what your animation is doing, but we're going to specifically switch over to the action editor, and that is going to give us direct access to these data structures that I just spoke about. So when we come down here in summary, I currently have the sphere selected, and we can see here in the Y location the keyframes for the animation that I set up. Likewise, let's come up here and look at the cube. We can see those keyframe animation bits of data right there for the cube, and likewise we could do that for the empty. But the key here is that each of these appear independently. So when I'm selecting one, we don't see what's happening in the other. In more complex animations, it would actually be very useful if you could reference multiple items and their animations in one area so you can see what the keyframe relationships are between those multiple items. So let's just take a look at this. If we come down here to the action editor and we come over here to this little button down here, it says Browse Actions to be linked, and we bring this up, we have a list of 3 actions that have been encoded for 3 individual objects. And so again, what Blender has done is it's simply taken cube, created an action and called it cube action, and encoded those keyframes in that action. This certainly works, but in this particular case, we've got 3 items that we're animating, and you're often going to need to reference other keyframes for other animation components so that you can synchronize them together. And that was more difficult to do in versions prior to Blender 4.4. And each object can have multiple actions. So if, for instance, you wanted to have one action that contained movement and another action that contained rotation, you could do that. But what Blender 4.4 has done is given us the ability to let one action contain the animation for multiple objects within that one action. So let's go ahead and just take a look right here. We can see that there's this new little icon that was not in versions previous to 4.4, and this is called an action slot. So let's go ahead now and back up and reanimate this using the 4.4 methodology with slots. Let's set our time marker back to the beginning of the animation. Let's just quickly remove the animations from each of the objects. Just clear that animation data out, and then we will come down, do a cleanup, and we're going to purge the actions that were assigned so that we no longer have any and we have a clean slate to work with. So starting off fresh in 4.4, we have the cube selected and we have the hierarchy set up, and we want to specifically create an action now instead of just starting to lay keyframes down. Remember, Blender is always going to create an action for you if you start keyframes, but we're going to do this explicitly here. Click New on the cube, and we're going to name this Cube and Sphere Animation, something descriptive, and we can see that appear as a name in an action underneath the animation entry for cube. So let's come back over and reanimate the cube. We're at minus 1.5 meters along the X, and we're going to click to create a new keyframe, but I want to bring your eyes' attention also to what happens right down here with the slot. Create the keyframe. We see the keyframe appear, but we also see this slotted action name appear, and it pulls the name from the object that it was created for. But this is the first thing that I want to really bring your attention to. It's created a new slot called Cube based on the name of the item it's animating. So the name Cube here is just the name of the slot that's been assigned to the object called Cube, but we can change that. So we're going to call this Cube X so that we know it's like moving along the X axis as an example. So let's come over to 100 and we're going to change this to positive 1.5 meters and we will lay our keyframe down. So we have an action and the actual keyframes for this X movement have been assigned to the slot called Cube X. We can see it down here too in blue. Cube X is the slot that sits within the action cube and sphere animation. So let's come down to the next item, which is the sphere rotation, where we want to encode the rotation for the sphere around the cube. And here we come down and we don't create a new action. We want this animation to be housed within inside the cube and sphere animation action. And this is what's new here in Blender 4.4. So now we can come back and rotate that. So we would come down and click new explicitly in this case because we're going to create a new slot for this empty. So we'll click new there. And we'll call this sphere rotation around Z because it's going to be rotated around Z. So then we come down and we just come over to rotation here around Z. We plot a keyframe and then come over to 100 and let's type in 720 and then we'll put the keyframe there. Okay, so we have a new entry here, a new slot within the action cube and sphere animation, and both of these animations are now encoded within this single action. So let's go ahead and do the same thing now. Come back to the beginning, and for sphere, we want to simply move it closer to the cube. So we'll come down and select cube and sphere animation, that action, and we need to click new. And we'll call the sphere closer to cube, so it's descriptive. Let's go ahead. We're going to move it along the local y-axis. So we come to location, y, place our keyframe down, and then we will come over and move it closer, and then place the final keyframe. And there we go. So now when we play this, we get all of the coordinated animations together. Now, the key here is that we have all of these keyframes that we can coordinate visually. So if we wanted to make a change to, say, how the sphere gets closer, we can reference the other keyframes, and that would be more difficult to do if we didn't have these slotted actions. So slotted actions are giving us this ability to coordinate things together. So I could then come in and see those keyframes relative to everything else in this group of animation. So then we come back over here and we could play this. We could see that finally get closer. Now, an important thing here is let's come back up to the cube and select the cube. We want to come down here to Object Properties. There's a new entry called Animation. And this is going to give us the ability to know what action and what slot we're currently editing. If we had multiple actions assigned to cube, we could select which of them we wanted to make an edit to. So this is something that you're going to see as this new animation entry for various objects. And it's important to kind of keep an eye on it for when you're doing animations. So far, we've just been working in the action editor, but there's another layer of animation that you can get down to called the nonlinear editor. And we're going to take a look at that next. So we come down to nonlinear editor. Now, before we get going too much further, I have actually made some changes to the default dark theme in Blender here to make this easier to look at. I'm going to put a link to it so you can install my theme, which is just a mildly modified version. I found that the colors that were in the default nonlinear editor were garish and they were difficult to work with. So mine down here is going to appear a little bit different. If you want to install my theme to get that, please go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. The nonlinear editor allows you to take actions and bring them down into this editor into what we call tracks that have action strips. The action strips reference back to the actions that we just plotted all that animation data into. So let's just take a look at this. If we come down here, we've got the names of each of the three objects. So the first thing to understand about the nonlinear editor is that it is listing things by object. And underneath that, it shows us that the object has an action, and it's giving us this little icon right here that says push down the action into a new data structure called a strip. So if I click that here, that becomes populated. I mentioned earlier that it's going to be really important to understand what Blender is doing in terms of naming these components. We have track, and then we have a strip on that track. And what it's done initially is just name the track after the action that it pulled that from. We can change that. And then we have the strip that's been applied onto that track, and it's also been given the name of the action it was derived from. But critically, it's important to know that we can name this for descriptive purposes, but most importantly, it's important to understand. Press the N key to bring up our panel over here. If we come down to Action Clip, it is specifically referencing the slotted action called CubeX from the cube and sphere animation action, because that's what's relevant to this cube object. So for instance, for clarity purposes, let's come over here and right click and rename this strip, and we'll call this Move Cube Along X, so that at a human level we can just read that very quickly and know what that action strip is doing. But again, we can come over here to Action Clip and we can see specifically what it's referencing. And we know exactly that it's bringing that data in from the CubeX slotted action. So let's come down to Sphere here and let's push down its action. And then we're going to do the same thing for the Sphere Rotation Empty. And then we can come over to the sphere and we can see that it is referencing, we're moving the sphere closer. So we could come over and rename that, for instance. We could do the same thing for the Sphere Rotation Empty down here. We could rename that action strip. So we could say rotating sphere around cube. Keeping note of the fact that even though we've named that action strip, it still references the cube and sphere animation action with its slotted action Sphere Rotation Z. Okay, so that's the thing about all this naming stuff, is you have to kind of keep track of what's going on. Let's go ahead now and add another panel. So I'm going to come down to the bottom, right click, and we're going to do a horizontal split. And I'm going to split this basically in half. And we want to, let's just come up to the top here and let's put this back to the dope sheet. And we're going to specifically make sure we're in the action editor. Now, if we want to begin editing the core keyframe animations, we can do it in one of two ways. We can directly select the action and the slotted action, or if you're using the nonlinear editor, then you can activate those from within inside the NLA editor here. So, for instance, let's collapse these, and we're just going to come to the cube, the Move Cube Along X, and if I hit the Tab key, we go into edit mode for that. But we're not really seeing anything appear up here in the action editor. And this can be really confusing if you don't know what's going on. In order to see the keyframes, we actually have to specifically actively select that cube, and then we can suddenly see all of the elements that we have here, the slotted actions and the keyframes that we want to edit. Now, if I come in here, I can activate this, and these are the keyframes that I would want to edit. And if I come back down here into the NLA editor, I can hit the tab again, and that leaves edit mode for that. It's just telling Blender that we're specifically going to focus on editing the keyframe data that's encased within inside of this strip. So let's come down to Sphere. Here again, I'm going to select that, press the Tab key, but I have to actually have Sphere selected in order to see that data. And then you have to come down here and manually select and edit what it is that you're wanting to do. So in this particular case, it's down here. Let's collapse these. The sphere transform along the y-axis. So this is where we would come over and we would make a change. Do you see what's happening down here? Is that it's giving us a preview of the change that we're making. And as soon as we're done, then we come down and press the tab key and it updates and activates that. Now, we could also just directly select the action for this particular object. And again, we only have one action in the scene. So if I came directly to activate that, I've got the sphere active. Let's go ahead and activate this sphere and cube animation action. And let's say that we came in here and again, we decided we wanted to make changes to the keyframes for the sphere moving closer to the cube. And so we've made these changes something like that. But we're not seeing any changes happening down here yet. But interestingly, you do notice something happen right down here is that you see a new entry appear, a new track with the little push down icon. And I was mystified when I first saw this happening because I was like, well, I'm making a change up here. Blender is still going to recognize that a change has been made. But because we're doing this manually, it's not going to make changes down here. It's going to allow us to push down a new strip based on the changes that we've made here, and we could mix the two together. So this is the key to remember, is that an action strip can be duplicated and can reference back to a single action up here in the action editor. But we don't want to do that for right now. I'm wanting to maintain the simplicity of what I already have. So I'm going to completely ignore this suggestion. And that's all this is right now, is a suggestion to push down a new action strip on a new track based on the changes that we've just made. But what I do want to do is come down here to the action strip area. And I just want to say, sync that change so that I know it's been populated down here. So it can be a little bit confusing what's happening, and I'm just, again, completely ignore this. I don't want to push a new action down. So that is the thing to remember, is that there are a couple of ways that you can approach editing an action if you're using the NLA editor. You can press the tab key to activate it, or you can directly select it. So it's just two ways of approaching editing the core data within inside of an action.